For decades, listeners believed the long pause before Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald began recording "Summertime" was nothing more than a technical delay, a skipped count-in, a producer adjusting a microphone, a minor studio hiccup that happened to survive on tape. That was the story most people told, if they thought about it at all. The truth was something else entirely. It was the summer of 1957, inside a recording studio in Los Angeles. The air conditioning hummed low in the background, fighting against the California heat that pressed in from outside. Thick black cables ran across the floor in loose coils, connecting a row of microphones to a console manned by engineers who had recorded some of the biggest names in American music. Acoustic panels lined the walls, and a single row of overhead lights cast a warm, even glow across the room. On one side sat Louis Armstrong, his trumpet resting across his knees, a folded white handkerchief tucked into his hand, the way it had been at countless performances before. On the other side stood Ella Fitzgerald, sheet music in front of her on a stand, though by then those who knew her well understood she rarely needed to look at it. They were there to record "Summertime" for an album that would become Porgy and Bess, a project pairing two of the most recognizable voices in American music for the first time on this scale. The album had been carefully planned, with arrangements by Russell Garcia and a full orchestra booked for the sessions. Everyone in the room understood what was at stake. This was not a casual afternoon of recording. This was history being built in real time, take by take, and everyone in that studio could feel it in the air. The arrangement had been rehearsed. The musicians were seated, instruments ready. The red light above the booth was prepared to turn on. And then, for almost a full minute, nobody moved. To understand why that minute mattered, it helps to understand exactly where each of them stood in that moment of their lives and careers. By 1957, Louis Armstrong was no longer the young cornet player from New Orleans, chasing his first break in the riverboat bands and small clubs of his youth. He was Satchmo to the entire world, a man whose trumpet and gravel-warm voice had carried American music across oceans, into concert halls in Europe, onto the radios of households who had never set foot in the United States. He had played for kings, for presidents, for crowds who didn't speak a word of English, but understood exactly what he meant when he raised that horn to his lips and let the first note hang in the air. He had spent more than 3 decades on stages, in smoky clubs, in recording studios, on tour buses crossing state lines at odd hours of the night, sleeping in unfamiliar towns, waking up to do it all again. But by this point in his life, Armstrong had also become something quieter than the public persona suggested. Offstage, those close to him described a man who was thoughtful, deliberate, almost meditative when it came to music. He listened more than he spoke during rehearsals. He paid close attention to small things, the way a phrase landed in a room, the way a pause could say more than a note ever could, the way a song needed to breathe before it could be played correctly. The wide, famous smile that audiences knew so well from films and television was real, but it lived alongside a man who took the craft of music with total seriousness, who had spent a lifetime refining an instinct that most people only saw the surface of. And on this particular afternoon, the person sitting across from him in that studio was someone whose voice he had admired from a distance for years, long before either of them had imagined sharing a microphone. Ella Fitzgerald had spent the better part of 2 decades becoming one of the most technically extraordinary vocalists in American music. She had come up through the big band era, found her voice alongside some of the finest orchestras in the country, and built a reputation for a kind of vocal control that other musicians spoke about with something close to reverence. Her phrasing was precise without ever sounding mechanical. Her ability to bend a melody, to stretch a note, or pull back at exactly the right moment gave her performances a sense of effortlessness that took most singers a lifetime to even approach. By 1957, Fitzgerald had already begun work on the songbook recordings that would later define much of her legacy. Meticulous, loving interpretations of America's greatest composers. There was very little left for Ella Fitzgerald to prove to anyone in that room or to the wider world. And yet, in the hour before Summertime was recorded, something in the studio shifted. Those who were present that day would later describe it carefully, almost cautiously, as if trying not to overstate something that, in the moment, had felt enormous and slightly difficult to put into words. The song itself carried weight before either of them sang a note. Summertime, from George and Ira Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, was already one of the most performed and most beloved pieces in American music. Written as a lullaby for the opera's opening scene, it had since been recorded by orchestras, by opera singers, by jazz musicians chasing their own interpretation of its slow, rocking melody and its long, aching vowels. To record it together, Armstrong's trumpet and voice paired with Fitzgerald's, was to step into a lineage of performances that audiences already knew by heart, and to add something to it that would either disappear into that lineage or stand apart from it entirely. The musicians took their positions around the studio floor. The engineers ran through their final checks, adjusting levels, confirming that every microphone was capturing exactly what it needed to capture. And then came the moment that would later be remembered by those in the room, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Armstrong sat with his trumpet across his lap, not yet raising it to his lips. Fitzgerald stood at her microphone, sheet music in hand, but her eyes were not on the page in front of her. For a long moment, neither of them moved toward the count-in. The engineers waited, headphones on, hands hovering near the controls. The musicians waited, bows and instruments ready. And the silence stretched on, far longer than anyone in the control room had expected or planned for. Some accounts from those present describe it as nerves, an unusual word to use for two performers of this stature, but not an inaccurate one. Others describe it as something closer to reverence. Two artists who had spent their entire lives commanding rooms, suddenly aware that what they were about to do together would be heard for generations, and that there was no version of good enough that belonged in this particular room on this particular afternoon. Armstrong, those close to him remembered, was not a man who rushed into a take. He believed a song had to be felt before it could be played, and he was known, even decades into his career, to sit quietly with a piece of music for a moment before he ever lifted his horn, letting the melody settle somewhere inside him first. On this day, with Ella Fitzgerald standing just a few feet away, that quiet stretched longer than usual, longer than the engineers were used to, long enough that, for a moment, no one was entirely sure what was happening. And then, without any announcement, without any cue from the booth, Louis Armstrong did something the engineers hadn't expected. He didn't raise his trumpet first. He didn't nod toward the conductor or signal for the orchestra to begin. Instead, he turned slightly toward Ella Fitzgerald, a small, simple gesture, barely more than a tilt of the head, as if to say, without a single word, "After you." It was barely visible from across the studio floor, but for the people standing close enough to see it, that gesture carried an enormous amount of meaning. Louis Armstrong, a man whose horn had opened more performances than almost anyone alive, whose entrance had announced the start of countless songs across 3 decades, was choosing, in this moment, not to lead. Fitzgerald, for her part, later described sessions like this one as some of the most demanding of her career, not because the music itself was difficult, but because of who she was sharing it with. Singing alongside Louis Armstrong meant singing alongside someone whose phrasing had shaped the entire language of American vocal jazz, someone whose recordings she had grown up listening to. Every musician in that room, in some way, owed something to the man sitting quietly with his trumpet across his knees. When the take finally began, those in the control room said the room itself seemed to exhale. Fitzgerald's voice entered first, soft and unhurried, carrying the opening lines of Summertime with the kind of restraint that turns a simple melody into something aching and tender. Her voice floated just above the orchestra, never pushing, never reaching for more than the moment required. Armstrong's trumpet followed a few bars later, not as a competing voice, but as a kind of conversation. Where Fitzgerald's voice floated, his trumpet answered low and warm, like a second voice finishing her sentences, filling the spaces she left open with a tone that seemed to come from somewhere even deeper than the instrument itself. There was no rush anywhere in the performance, no flourish added simply to be noticed, no moment that called attention to itself. Instead, what emerged from that take was something closer to 2 old friends taking turns telling the same story, each one trusting the other completely to carry it forward when it was their turn. The engineers, used to take after take, multiple versions, edits, and overdubs stitched together in post-production, found themselves with something rare, a performance that didn't need to be chased. The take that would end up on the record was close to what happened that very first time the tape rolled, the same take that had been preceded by that long, unexplained silence that no one in the room had planned for. In the years that followed, Summertime, from Porgy and Bess, became one of the most celebrated recordings of both Armstrong and Fitzgerald's careers, a pairing that listeners returned to again and again, drawn to something in the recording that was difficult to name but easy to feel. Critics praised the chemistry between the 2 voices, the way the trumpet and the vocal seemed to breathe together rather than simply share a track. Audiences who had grown up hearing Armstrong's trumpet on the radio and Fitzgerald's voice in concert halls and on record players in their living rooms now had a recording that placed both of those sounds side by side, speaking to each other in real time, as if they had always belonged together. But the story of that long silence before the first take rarely made it into the liner notes or the radio specials that celebrated the album in the years afterward. It lived instead in the memories of the handful of people who had been in that studio that afternoon, engineers, musicians, a producer or 2, who had stood in that room and felt the air change before either artist sang a note. Over time, as those people retold the story to friends, to colleagues, to younger musicians curious about how the recording had come together, the silence became something almost mythical, a small, private moment that had somehow made its way onto one of the most beloved jazz recordings of the century without ever being heard directly. What they witnessed in that minute of silence wasn't hesitation, and it wasn't nerves in the way the word is usually understood. It was two of the most accomplished musicians in American history recognizing, without needing to say it aloud, that they were about to do something that mattered, and giving that moment the respect it deserved before they let it begin. Louis Armstrong spent his life turning instinct into art, performance after performance, decade after decade, in clubs and concert halls and studios across the world. But it was in this quiet, unscripted moment, before the tape rolled, before the world ever heard "Summertime" sung this way, that something essential about who he was became visible. Not the showman audiences knew from the stage, not Satchmo grinning for the cameras and the newsreels. Just a musician, sitting with his trumpet across his knees, choosing, for just a moment, to let someone else go first. And somewhere on that reel of tape, preserved without anyone planning it, that silence is still there. A brief, unrepeatable pause before two voices that the world had never heard together finally found each other and never let go.